Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And if you can't tell, this might be a bit of a different video. An experiment I've wanted to try for a very, very long time. And where I will try to keep all the vibes as relaxed as possible. I think you all might be familiar with ASMR if you're on YouTube in any way. But for the true connoisseurs out there, there will be some music that'll slip into the background across my reviews, as per tradition. And as much as I tried to keep things very ambient in this episode, it may not be to your own unique pleasures. But all that being said, let's ascend on the pulse. So we have 7 albums on the docket. We're going to start off with, from Richard Batchelor, Sanctuary. Okay, we're actually going to start this off with 2 albums from patrons. The first from instrumental producer Richard Batchelor. He's been putting out projects across a lot of the 2010s, spanning from more elaborate orchestral arrangements to more minimalist piano work to even some grooves that are closer to a more textured hip-hop vibe. And while overall tends to be a little bit sleepy, for the most part, the production, the melodies, they're fine enough. They can produce a pretty okay vibe. So putting this album on my ambient list, probably fudging things just a little bit, but it is working to cultivate something closer to a new age sound through its Japanese plucked strings contrasting with the more contemporary string arrangements alongside it. So maybe I could see this fitting just a little bit. But the keening, sharper strings tones, they rarely pick up a firmer low-end tone to balance them out consistently in that range, which makes them spike out of the mix and compromise some of these vibes, draw attention to the melodic compositions, which have the feel of importing some classical folk chord progressions to instrumentals that don't always well suit them, maybe using them as facets of the richer well of synth, some better blending so they feel a little bit more organic rather than so oddly jagged, or maybe build any sort of consistent flow from track to track. There were things that could have been done here. It feels more like trying to capture individual compositional snippets rather than build to a more cohesive whole. And honestly, it's kind of a shame that so few of these snippets really work for me, even if there is a nested, plucky intricacy that I do like. Doesn't help that it kind of runs long and fades in the back half, even if I do think it ends pretty well when some of the heavier percussion comes in. But we are talking about ambient music here, so very strong 5 out of 10 if you're curious. Next up from Patricia Taxxon, Crocus. I don't normally cover Patricia Taxxon's ambient albums, mostly because it's kind of hard to find much to say about ambient projects, but also because since Cicada, I'm not sure I have found one that captures the same spacious presence and weight. But one of my other patrons was curious about this, and, well, if you know her sound and interest, it'll be a satisfyingly solid but not a surprising listen. slower, spacious pieces that bookend the project, burbling synth passages across the middle, including this glittery piece in Crocus 3 with some subtly brilliant syncopation that wouldn't feel out of place off of Traveler or Rainbow Road, and then a sample right in the middle of the album that provides just enough framing to subtly recontextualize the entire thing. This time it's pulled from an Italian neo-realist film, Acatone, from the early 1960s, where, if you don't know the sample and you don't speak Italian, might come across as some vintage romanticism. But in reality, it's an impressively bleak film, focusing on failures to extricate oneself from poverty through pimping, where the male lead finds some sympathy for his prostitute. He lets her go. He then fails at finding honest work, and then dies in an accident. And yet, it is very interesting, placed in contrast with a lot of the symbolic meanings of the crocus flower throughout mythology, which is often of hope framed in dire times. The winter will end, the flowers will bloom. So while Patricia Taxxon's ambient albums have an understood framing and arc by this point, at their best, they can be still genuinely beautiful. The first half of the album building off the layered twinkle and the compositionally striking Crocus 4. It's potent as hell. It's just kind of a shame that when she tries a similar approach on Crocus 6, it didn't really click. But you know what? That's more of a factor of the ending of the album being a little bit weak overall. Still, though, pretty stuff. If you like her ambient work, you'll like this. Solid 7 out of 10. Check it out. Next up, from Katia Krow, I've called off the search. I know exactly where you are. I remember having a conversation in my Discord surrounding the difference between ambient music and drone music, and where the former focuses on melodic progression and atmosphere, drone circles repetition, which in my experience tends to be why it's so much slower and heavier and downbeat, and most often just not for me. But of all the albums I collected here, hailing from the United Arab Emirates, Katia Krow's full-length debut album might be the darkest and the bleakest. It doesn't start that way. Clear twinkles of synth ricochet off the cyclical acoustic guitar lines that grow all the more hazy and lo-fi. The central melodies sinking between the titanic rumbles that will shake the mix, or even some dusty field recordings of machinery and roadways that evoke an even heavier sense of desolation. But even the twinkles pick up traces of a bladed edge, and the sweet tunes contort or just sink ever deeper into the shuddering fuzz, where there may have been traces of macabre beauty turning to ashen texture, the song titles indicating some unceasing change, until a point of grim certainty, where you might try to evolve, but if you're stuck within the same framework, you'll wind up a forgotten casualty. They can call off the search. They know exactly where you are, unmoving amidst the rubble, and thus the half-heard vocals only amplify all that haunted atmosphere, because it's not like they're coming to help you. The progression into the shuddering, droning noise on the final few pieces here make this one of the most dour and genuinely unnerving ambient and drone pieces you might hear, at least in this vein, in 2021. but it's also one so textured and layered and melodic that it makes you want to keep sifting through that rubble. Won't be for everyone. Now, this brand of bleakness doesn't even always work on me consistently, and the drone side of this album does mean it drags in patches, maybe runs a little long, but for its progression, its sense of atmosphere, it's impressive and kind of terrifying. Light 8 out of 10. You'll want to hear this. It's something special. And while we're in this territory, from Grandbrothers, All the Unknown. Now, this is a German duo I was very happy to discover in this little experiment. Active across the latter half of the 2010s, their debut album had such a bouncy, crystalline vibrancy, and how it structured its melodic grooves that I found so enjoyable in a very piano-driven post-rock sort of way. And even if their 2017 follow-up lost a little bit of that color, I was still kind of kicking myself that I had not found them sooner. So now, on this release, for as much as their fast-paced staccato but dreamy piano work remains the foundation of their sound, there are more acoustic flutters here, splashes of glossy strings, and clicking, sandy patters of more developed percussion. There's still something very post-rock in the crystalline build and the expansive sounds they accumulate in their crescendos. But while it can often feel like it's searching and expanding, it never overwhelms you like post-rock can, mostly because, for all of the intricate craftsmanship that could make this feel so cold, so antiseptic, there's a tasteful playfulness to its swells and jittery keys that can capture that swell I just love in the sound of ambient music. Unfortunately, it doesn't stay in this territory, especially by the final quarter. It becomes so much more cold and melancholic. The percussion becomes heavier and more trudging. An album that was yearning to venture off into the unknown, then it either didn't like what it found or must return home to its misery. It's also an album that, for as much melodic color as it tries to sample with its pianos, as much as it tries to center it, can start to run a bit together in the blurrier moments. And yet, even with that, there's so much kinetic vibrancy that's very difficult to dislike. Not quite surpassing their debut, but still pretty great, even if it is kind of skirting the definition of ambient. Light 8 out of 10. Check it out. Next up from Sue, Yellow River Blues. This was a debut album I had seen recommended a number of times this past month that sank into ambient textures, but also explored fluttery touches of dream pop, traditional Chinese music, and even some Krautrock and dub. And unlike our first album, where adapting some neoclassical compositions into Asian-inspired instrumentals could feel a little bit sterile, to use some complimentary words, Sue's approach in both the composition and the production feels considerably more organic overall. The fizzy ambient swells around the thickened rubbery bass lines, the spongy splashes of chirping synths, the echoing vocal fragments, the touches of birdsong, and the prominent textured percussion gives this mix a live sense of graininess that rewards the textural side of a more ambient mix and lends it maybe even a hint of groove. Just kind of a shame the flow across this project feels weirdly abortive, leaden even, amidst the muted soft focus. Less emphasis on tune or swells of atmosphere, which might even feel more organic if it didn't feel like the mixes would shudder and fracture as often as they do. I don't know, the album feels more comfortable leaning towards a minimalist dub palette rather than any sense of ambient music, but for some of those background textures and the overall serene vibe that would place it in there, or at least until you get the wonky metallic cuts like Klein. But even then, the sequencing feels ever so slightly askew. The album feels shorter than it is for the wealth of ideas that are on display, and I found myself wishing that what we got landed with a little bit more impact. So, strong 6 out of 10. A fascinating listen that's picked up some considerable attention if you know who you're listening to. I just wish I found more that I could like. And while we're on that subject, from Bicep, Isles. I'm starting to think this might be a tenuous genre definition to base an ASMR video, especially as Bicep has always branded themselves as ambient house or ambient techno along with UK garage. Well, given that I missed their debut breakthrough in 2017, I figured I owed myself to get into their pulsating, glossy sound, and, well, the debut was fine enough, I guess. A little beholden to its influences and not quite as sticky as I was hoping, but maybe some of that would evolve on their follow-up that dropped this year? Well, I'm of a few minds on that. This is absolutely the most traditionally accessible on this list, courtesy of its faded vocal snippets, the sharper, burbling synths that will rise and fall out of the ambience, the chalky percussion grooves, and even a couple metallic techno touches on X, Fur, and Hawk that reflect the most passive, fleeting glances at what the PC music crew are doing. But the tunes overall feel a little bit more subdued, often settling into an understated vibe that makes you feel like it's missing a point of climax, where the cavernous expanse of their mix might reveal something more, but it's not there. If there's a dance to be found, it's desolate and abandoned, which Bicep has emphasized was the point in this more homebound project that came out of recordings last year. But it still falls into an odd, uncanny valley where the ambient wistfulness feels cold and the dance floors feel more technically defined rather than truly evoking ghosts. It's kind of odd when they do have a little bit more organic texture in the haunted vocals and especially the percussion. But even those house touches can feel oddly clinical, where the most propulsive moments feel almost desperate to make it material, but never quite magnetic. Just kind of sadly a little antiseptic by the end. 5 out of 10. I wanted to like it more. And finally, from Loathe, The Things They Believe. Of when Bring Me the Horizon at the end of 2019 tried to drop their own glitchy electronic experiment. Does Loathe think they are really there already? Well, here's the funny thing. They might already be pass them in this particular lane, because this is actually a pretty credible ambient pivot for this group. The mixes will crackle and swell with waves of sandy static and haunted twinkles that kind of remind me a bit of early 2010s Tim Hecker, specifically Rave Death 1972. On the darker tracks, the influence is just flagrant. But with the synth swells, some of the touches of strings, or even the introductions of some low saxophone from John Waugh, who you might recognize from a lot of his more distinctive work with the 1975, it shows more of a contemporary sophistopop or even synthwave inspiration, especially for as organic as the blending actually turned out to be. It's got some of that same fractured, eerie side of Loathe's experiments in metalcore, and has some of that whiplash. And I will say some of the shorter, more abortive fragments of this little experiment, they suffer as a result. But the flow is considerably stronger, allowing melodic tones to linger and unspurl across the static, echoing eerie calls that create the vibe of looking across the evening sky at a distant storm passing by, where you can feel the electricity in the air, but it never overpowers you. And the touches of birdsong and static and the humidity of the night by the very end encapsulate that rich feeling. That being said, there are traces where you can tell they wanted to introduce a little bit more instability than they really needed. The percussion slipping behind black marble, when really a lot of the off-key synth moans, they were plenty effective. And I will say the album does feel oddly short, even despite a terrific set of closing songs. But for a side project diversion like this, it's frankly better than it's got any right to be. And it might just be one of the biggest pleasant surprises that I have found thus far in early 2021. Hey Loathe, you sure you want to stay a metalcore band? Because this is an extremely light 8 out of 10. What a pleasant find. Give it a chance. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I can't promise I'll do more of these videos. I think it's going to depend upon the response to this. I also know that the sound baffling is not great. My studio is still not really set up to take the best expanse and use of the new microphone that I had, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do this video. But hey, if this sort of thing is your vibe, I would be very happy to hear about it. And those who are into more ASMR, I would really appreciate your feedback and insight. I know it wasn't really trying to cause any tingles here, but again, just an experiment for when I talk about ambient music. Make this a little bit more distinctive. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum.